Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams Tea Podcast, where you spill the jams, spill the tea, and it's hit. We're here. We made it. Merry Christmas. We have decided to give you on the day celebrating the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Merry Chrysler.
The gift. Merry Christmas. Here we have the top 20 albums of the year for the Jams and Tea Podcast. We have been going since 2020, but we have been running this entire fucking show throughout the entirety of this year. So we have a huge selection of records to choose from, a big fucking giant ass list.
Mm-hmm.
And you know
really
what?
Say,
I think
we're making a list and we've checked it twice.
We've checked it more than twice. We're even more thorough. Santa, you can get fucked. So
yeah.
That said,
hell yeah.
We've already identified who's been naughty, and we've given them a big spanking in our worst of the year videos. But now it's time to celebrate those who've been nice and maybe spank them as well if they're into it. So it's been a great year. Obviously, don't need us to say that. It's been an amazing year. We're spoiled for choice. But I should say as a caveat that if there's an album that doesn't feature on this list that you love, that we don't shout out, it's because it sucks. And the only good albums that came out this year are the 20 that we're going to talk about today. Everything else was absolutely not even close to making it. And that's total
garbage.
That's totally sincere, by the way, and not at all sarcastic in any way possible. No, it was absolutely
garbage.
It was not at all one of the best years for music of the last 10 years. In
fact, every album that isn't in this top 20 is as bad as every Hobo Johnson album. They're all terrible, and you should actually feel bad for liking them.
Especially if you like a Hobo Johnson album.
Let's please take this bit behind the barn and euthanize it, and let's get started with counting down our 20 favorite albums of the year. Number 20 on our list. One of the most beautiful things about doing this podcast and by that I mean like becoming more attentive to new music on a weekly basis and making more of an effort to listen to new shit that I've never heard before, never heard of, purely to be in the know, is that occasionally an artist will come along who has had a storied career that I've never heard of, not once in my life. And I'll go from complete unfamiliarity with whoever this person is to being utterly besotted with their artistic output and convinced they're one of the greatest artistic minds of the last fucking generation. And for no artist in 2020, no artist who's been around for a long time anyway, in 2021, is that more true than Lil Ugly Mane, whose album Volcanic Bird Enemy and the Voiced Concern sees him completely essentially dissociating from the hip-hop pastiche music he originally came up on in his kind of early mixtape era, moving further in the direction of his amazing, remarkable, fucking dour hip-hop fucking suicide opus Oblivion Access, and making a patchwork collision of sounds that represents the inner workings of his brain for the last several years, a period during which he hasn't put out very much music at all. But it's a solid fucking masterpiece that he's come back with and absolutely fucking destroyed my life in a way that, a few albums typically tend to do this every year, but very seldom are they records that are as creatively and stylistically all over the fucking place as this record is, which I think is reflected in the fact that it wasn't a universal hit on the podcast, was a little bit divisive. But ultimately, for me, I think Jake has said this before about one other record on the podcast, and I can't remember what it was, but it was like, it doesn't matter if like everyone else in the world hated this. The fact that it exists and that I have it is all that matters to me. And that's essentially how I feel about Volcanic Bird Enemy and the Voiced Concern. It is a collage of psychedelic rock, of indie rock, of incredible sampling genius that is sort of transfused together into this opus to being depressed and dissociated and entirely lost within a kaleidoscopic world of suffering and emptiness. It's truly the fucking soundtrack for our motherfucking time, in my opinion. And I urge you, if you've never heard this record, to go out and put it in your fucking library right now, because there's a very solid chance that if you're anything like me, and if your tastes incline in any way to the sort of music that I and we talk about, there's a chance that you could fucking love this. Number 19 on our list is August's second favorite album of the year.
It was something I didn't initially realize just the sheer brilliance of. And it took me about 10 listens before I was really into it and fully realized its genius. And then I've listened to it another 10 or so odd times just to confirm that genius. But what I find so captivating is that even divorced from the narrative of this band, of course, tragically, Groggs passed away during the production of this album. But I think even divorced from the personal tragedy of that, this is still a fantastically compelling album. The sheer level of the beat smithing on this album, the production, is worlds of mind-blowingly interesting. I love the production, the sound of it, the number of influences it cribs from ambient electronic, things that would typically not even phase the mind of a regular hip-hop producer, but that creativity is enough of itself. The emotionality of tracks like Superman That and Knees are just gutting, and those songs on their own are fantastic works of lyricism. And then there's the fact that this is just one of the most anxiety inducing and simultaneously fun records we've had all year. I've waxed lyrical about Inside in our best songs video, which you should watch if you haven't, and I could say much the same for most of the songs on here in terms of their quality, their Lovecraftian nature of terror, anxiety, and fun they bestow within me. I think it's a fantastic album that puts a dark hole in the middle of your day and then patches it in its own unique way. Bars.
Part of what's so exciting about it is just how indescribable and incomprehensible it is. Like, it kind of exists as a rare example of music that has no precedent. No precedent. Like, there are individual tiny elements of some songs where you think, okay, this is kind of taking a bit from breakcore, or this is taking a bit from industrial music. But as a whole, there's no precedent for what Injury Reserve do on this record. And those kinds of albums are exceedingly rare, kind of terrifying to fucking comprehend, let alone think about talking about, and absolutely should be treasured whenever they come to exist, because that's the gold mine diamond in the fucking rough when you discover a fucking record like that. I think, August, I mean, your tastes for what you consider to be the most sort of significant music is reflected in your ability to appreciate that, because I would also describe the Microphones in 2020 album as a similar sort of record where there's just no precedent for what he's doing on that album. But yeah, by the time I get to Phoenix, is so much more overwhelming and kind of like saturating you in the sound of existing in chaos. Internally, externally, you can contextualize that or add a narrative to that, any kind of narrative that you want, pandemic, grief, whatever, but it's just about the chaos of a turmoiled, state of consciousness. And there's themes of, returning home, of coming full circle with the title of the album, but also obviously calling back to Isaac Hayes' classic song on Hot Buttered Soul as well. So reference points from the past bleeding into the present and the future. The presence of Groggs when he seldom turns up on this record, despite the fact that his vocals were recorded before obviously recorded before his passing.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be crazy if they weren't, but still
now that would be transgressive.
Their implementation of the Ouija board, it was really inspired, frankly.
Number 18 on our list, August. It's your lucky day again, because it's another August Core 2021 record.
There he goes through the crowd, unprincipled.
This was particularly shocking because I had not heard of this band, and when I saw a lot of their previous branding, I was entirely convinced this would not be as big of a hit for me as it was. And what I got was something completely counter to my expectations. This record is energized. It is depraved feeling. It is an uncomfortable, haunting experience that just lingers with you. I think this is almost best exemplified by when this album kicks off with The Turning of Our Bones, a song which is just this slow, creeping build into the dark, depraved world of this album. And it's just so, it makes me so gleeful to hear the filth and the uncomfortable sexuality this album indulges in. I love that element of it. And then there's the disco elements of this album, which make for some flat bangers like Here Comes Comus, one of my favorite songs of the year, and a fantastically electrifying single. It's really just how uncomfortably gross it all feels, and how it's just these two guys who are now so very old, feeling like they're now coming back to life in the best, most exciting way for me possible.
Yeah, I mean, the unique appeal of Arab Strap to me has always been like how sort of like grossly they're able to tackle, like, not grossly, but like how pointedly they capture the experience of the kind of grossness of sexuality at times, like how, you know, sex itself and sex in the UK and in the modern world in an environment of like, you know, drunkenness and debauchery is itself this kind of like, you know, carnal animosity or whatever. But what's beautiful about this new record and what makes it such a sharp return is that all of that stuff about sexuality that they've done in the past is now contextualized in the online era, and the era of sex existing in the online landscape and that's obviously reflected in the album cover and in the subject matter of a lot of the songs on this record. There's a beautiful song on this record about like where Aidan Moffat, the singer of this band, recounts like almost biographically an experience of like bringing up his secret porn stash on his computer and staring at it. And then like just after a while just feeling really, really bad and closing it and going to bed.
And it's stuff that on the face has become so everyday to us that they have this power to transcend into being creepy, uncomfortable material.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of one of my favorite songs of the last few years, which is Richard Dawson's Heart Emoji off of 2020, which is a song that deals with like modern sexuality in the digital age for like an older person in a similarly kind of like funny but also disgusting way. And Arab Strap is so great at doing that, which is why, you know, if you're going to make a comeback, you want your album to represent what you are, what your identity is, but also in a new way that feels like it's justifying coming back in the first place. And I think that the genius of As Days Get Dark is how well it does that, to the point where it feels like one of the most essential records they've ever made, and as good a fulsome statement about their identity as musicians and songwriters as anything they've ever done. So yeah, I'm glad this record has really hit it off with you.
Yes.
Number 17 on our list.
Who let the dope boys out? Thank God you let me crash on your couch.
I think the through through line this year for albums that I've loved, and really albums that a lot of us have loved, have been a stark contrast to albums last year, which is last year it was all about the darkness and about trying to power, like, just not even power through, just sort of embrace it and sort of be content with it and embracing that side. Whereas the albums that I've loved this year are albums that make me feel as though I want to push through it all, to act despite it, and that have made me feel good and happy and warm. And nothing embodies this better than Roadrunner, just because there is a hefty amount of darkness on this album, but never just that. It's always complicated. It's always about perseverance in the face of adversity, and a lot of it too is just because the album's really fucking fun. This has some of the best bangers of their career. It has some of the best contemplative songs of their career. It has maybe the widest sound palette that they've ever worked with, and it's anchored by the really distinct, emotional journey that's anchored by Kevin and Joba. And it's just an album that is infinitely re-listenable because of the variety, the features, the fun, the flow. It's the ideal Brockhampton experience. It's fulfilling the potential of Brockhampton as a project. And in a lesser year, this would have easily been my favorite record to have been released this year. But I mean, I've been paying close attention to music since 2016, which I've had sort of as the high watermark for album releases that I've paid attention to. And 2021 has swiftly kicked 2016's ass, because I mean, even in that year, if this album came out, that probably would have been my album of the year. So I mean, anything goes at this fucking point. Thank you to the Brockhampton boys for doing what they do best ever, better than they've ever done it.
Number 16 on our list is one of the year's most electric indie pop records.
Whenever Michelle Zauner is asked about her intentions with Jubilee, she's always contextualized it in the fact that the first two Japanese breakfast albums are particularly preoccupied with grief after the passing of her mother, and that she wanted Jubilee to be first and foremost about joy. And Jesus, yeah, he nailed it. Good work. What a resounding triumph of an album. Listening to it is an absolute pleasure and a joy.
That feeling of kind of total infectious joy that pervades this album, which it has its moments of sadness too. I mean, the song In Hell on this record is one of the saddest fucking songs of the year. But predominantly, when you listen to this record and you hear a song like Paprika, which, I mean, you've got, Jams and Tea Catnip, when you're going to name a song after a Satoshi Kon movie and make it a kind of like horn-laden indie pop banger.
And you make it sound like the Susumu Hirasawa score to that movie.
Yes. Yeah, it's critic catnip for the critics and for us. And it's really the first of just endless pleasures that this album offers, even down to its deep cuts, songs like Tactics and Posing in Bondage. Posing in Bondage has been one of my favorite songs to put on this year when I'm just driving around at night, because it has this beautiful sort of nocturnal feeling that is so well set to that, and totally contrasts with the beautiful brightness of songs like Slide Tackle and Be Sweet. And of course, the incandescent sort of guitar solo opus of the closer, Posing for Cars. It's a really tight, compact 10-song indie pop rock record that my own love for it is doubly impressive and surprising and delightful for me, considering I've actually been pretty lukewarm on this band in the past. But it shows just what a remarkable step forward this album is for Michelle, who has had one of the most, she put out a New York Times best-selling book this year as well. She's had a better year than all of us.
What an awesome, just bright, fun pop record to just exist. And amidst there's still a lot of art that's coming out about quarantine and what have you. So it's real nice that a lot of albums this year just unapologetically dedicated themselves to being full of really sunny, summery bangers. This made my list as well, and I wish it could have been higher, just because I really do love it so much, and it sounds like I've underplayed it just because of how like low relatively it ranks on my list. But thanks, Michelle.
Hell yes. And number 15 on our list, an album that has no shortage of love this year at all, much like Japanese Breakfast Record.
Niger women got the melanin dripping and a Wendy O-N city girl living.
It's just this grand, symphonic, overly ambitious hip hop album that encompasses everything that makes the genre great. The instrumentation, the beats on this are some of the most creative we've seen all year, with incorporations of big band jazz sounds, as well as guitars and even more conventional hip hop. And the one Miss Simbi at the center of it, delivering just fantastic flows, deliveries, hooks. She is a great personality. I loved her in Venom too. This album is,
Did you do that because she has a song called Venom, or just...
No, she's in the movie Venom 2.
Oh,
She
right.
is.
Okay, well, she also has one of her best songs on her last album is actually called Venom, so that's really funny also.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
All comes together, motherfucker.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sims has always been an artist that's shown a lot of promise, and if you go back and listen to Grey Area, which, comparatively is like super understated compared to this, and I thought that was a fucking near masterpiece. She is expanding her ambition and scope and scale and the size of her music in ways that few artists even dare to try anymore. And it's all held together by her absolute command of storytelling, of being able to regale us with the narrative of her life and of the life of members of her family as well, some of whom she often raps from the perspective of. And to just, I guess, paint this vivid portrait of growing up in the UK, of blackness, of hip hop, of womanhood, and of course, of more than any of that, of being Simbi, of being herself.
The layers of purpose buried in this are so great. The references to this broader theme of dichotomy is really the purpose she's infusing into most of these tracks. How sometimes she is this, other times she is this, and how you cannot, like one of those particular elements, blackness, womanhood, fame, do not strictly define her, nor do their exact opposites. It is this really intimate, full portrait of her as a person, which is part of the reason this is so brilliant.
Moving forward into the number 14 album on our list, we have the sensational new record from Sweet Trip.
Of the albums I have been feverishly re-listening to this year, I'm fairly certain Sweet Trip takes the cake for the one I've come back to the most. And it sounds slightly degrading when I say this, but it's almost purely for just the achievement of the way that this album sounds. I've gotten really into this band as a whole just because of this album, just kind of diving into them to properly contextualize this, but also just because I love what they do. I love You Can Never Know Why's focus on dreamy indie rock and the more IDM and glitch focus of something like Velocity Design Comfort. But this album feels like a synthesis of everything they've done, a monument to everything that the Sweet Trip sound can encompass, which is so impressive because it's like their style goes from shoegaze to dream pop to glitch to IDM, electronic, fucking anything you can fathom in this world of very niche alternative music. And they've smashed it all together into this giant record, which is north of an hour, but never feels its length just because of how dynamic these songs are. Songs will just stop themselves and destroy themselves with these glitchy segments and then just become something else. And it's so exciting and colorful and sugary. It's like this album is magic. Just listening to it, the vocal harmonies, the way they the two vocalists interact is just absolutely wonderful. I didn't get to properly display my true affection for this when we covered it, just because that was a very long recording session, and we were all very, very tired by the end of it. But this is an album that I have just a supreme, huge affection for. This is something that's climbed to like the tip top of some of my favorite albums list. And it's just because I've been able to have this soundtrack, some of the best memories I've had coming from this year, to the point where I just have a real fondness for the music, sort of like separated from it, but also connected to it. And just that this is just an album that makes me happy. I listen to it and so much of it just makes me want to dance. It's just an album that's purely focused on being fun and textural. Every sound, every instrument on this album, every single choice that's made here feels deliberate. Like if a guitar on one song and a guitar on another song might as well be completely different fucking instruments, the way that Sweet Trip uses them. You can tell that their sort of homemade DIY approach is never an excuse to be lazy. In fact, and it's an excuse to be borderline progressive. Their attention to detail is just absolutely unrivaled. This is one of the most purely fun musical experiences I've ever had with a record, and I can only thank Roby and company for just being really swell people. And thank you for checking out our episode, guys. That was really nice of you. That was just the cherry on top of the entire Sweet Trip experience, was the fact that they listened to what we had to say about the album.
Number 13 on our list is, much like the Little Sims record, another kind of opus of personality, of flair, of musicality, of hip hop, and of genre fusion bending, and all of this kind of beautiful stuff.
This is worth celebrating just for the sheer scope of Mr. Owusu's ambitions in hip hop and his incredibly unique explorations of depression and racism through lenses which us simpleton hip hop listeners have. You rarely get a chance to hear an Australian someone raised in Australia talk about racism and how it functions over in that continent, especially towards people of African descent. So that element in and of itself is enough to make this noteworthy and something to look at. But it's topped off by the fact that this is just so creatively produced. Of course, this was an album that was produced mostly in a kind of live, frenetic studio environment where the band really was completely collaborative and built these songs out of jam sessions. So it speaks to someone who cares not only about their lyrics, but also their instrumentation and how the record sounds. And immediately that's something that's going to be a big plus for me. This album cleaved into two halves, and both halves have their number of memorable moments and interesting deluges into their various subject matters of depression and racism, all while this being a fun, bouncy R&B record with a whole heap of influences, and it just culminates into one of the most fun, re-listenable projects of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. That jamming quality of the instrumentation, like the sense of camaraderie between Genesis and his bandmates and stuff, like that's a big part of what makes these songs so invigorating and exciting, and works as a kind of like subtextual, flourish and detail that comments on, like that contrasts at points with the kind of isolation that he speaks about in some of these songs, as well as the kind of camaraderie and communal aspects of the cultures that he celebrates and the world that he, the dichotomy between his existence in Australia and his cultural roots, and how what life is like for people of color in a predominantly white, heavily sort of colonized environment. And all of these things, there's a melting pot of all of these things that are visited at various points. And the album kind of takes you on a genre journey as well, as you kind of weave from one track to the next, and you're experiencing funk, you're experiencing R&B, you're experiencing rock, you're experiencing straight indie, you're sometimes experiencing fucking club music, dance music on this album, all over the fucking shop. And you're never less than totally engrossed and just sort of in awe of the journey you're being taken on. So for me, also one of the absolute standouts of this year. Moving on to our number 12 on the list, and it almost feels anticlimactic to be ticking this album off already, because it's an album that's had such hype among us.
This is my favorite progressive rock album ever recorded. I'm the prog rock guy, so, take that with what you will. And that's not even the most lofty genre claim. That's not the only one I've got this year, but, just wait for it. But man, there's just no shortage of wonderful, amazing things I can say about this album. And yet again, it's sort of one where I did my best when we reviewed the record, but it was, again, a long ass recording session and I was tired. So it didn't get the verve that maybe it deserved from me. And it's also just such a fucking behemoth. The World is a Beautiful Place, I'm No Longer Afraid to Die started as a relatively more like unambitious Midwest emo act who incorporated elements of post-rock into their sound and what have you. But, if you told me back when that album came out that they would eventually venture into full-blown progressive music, I would be like, that sounds like it would be a fucking disaster. But they've done it like they've been doing it since the beginning, frankly. And everything about this record is astonishing. The fact that, structurally speaking, it's cleanly divided into a perfect 3 acts, and each one of them has something incredible to offer. They've have songs that are just the most pop and hook ready songs they've ever made, like Queen Sophie for President, which just showcased the mainstream appeal that this band has sort of always had, that they have, singles potential, but also some of the darkest and most emotionally evocative things that they have ever made. This album, front to back, is a production marvel. Every single sound it makes, every instrument feels like it is the best that respective instrument has ever sounded in any context. The guitar work on this is beyond virtuosic. It just oscillates between being just fucking shredding its ass off and then just being complete, like to the point where it almost feels masturbatory if it didn't like anchor itself into being so calculated in the structures of these songs. The strings on all across the album sound absolutely beautiful. The singing from every single vocalist is just, it's impassioned, it's raw, it's exactly what you fucking want from something like this. And it feels almost like as if it's 2 albums packaged into one, where the first half of the album is these select different songs that are, The World is a Beautiful Place progressive rock songs, but they're very much what you would expect for them taking this direction. And then the second half of it, as it were, is the final 2 songs, which are these insane, huge, long, progressive post-rock opuses. We talked about our favorite song of the year, the closing track, Fewer Afraid, already on our best songs list. But the song that precedes it, Infinite Josh, I know I'm definitely not alone in this and thinking that this song is every bit as good as the closer. Hell, I could totally see why someone would even prefer it, because the way it starts, the really evocative, emotional writing about recalling childhood and never being able to quite go back afterwards, but still the nostalgic reminiscence of this album, it's at its apex here. And that is the core of why this works so well. The sound of all of it, the structure of all of it, all of that works for me. And it works for me as well as anything has ever worked. But it's the emotions here that are what make this my favorite album of the year. This is an album that's about cloaking the darkness of the world into something that you can manage. It's about survival. It's about, it's sort of dressed up in this illusory walls, this fantastical sort of element that dresses down conceptually, living in the world as if it were a fantasy novel. There are reference to video game stuff. There's an interpolation of a Final Fantasy battle theme on the third song on this record. I mean, it's nerdy out the ass, and I, of course, love the shit out of that. But it feels as though they understand these things and need to filter it through this conceptual element to be able to process the world around them. And it's an album that's about working. It's about being alive right now, being young. And there's a lyric on here in Infinite Josh, our dreams get drowned in a river of present needs, which is the lyric that summarizes this album. And that's the core of what makes it special to me, is that sort of, our dreams getting drowned in a river of present needs. This album makes it so, it motivates me so that my dreams don't get drowned in a river of my present needs. I have worked my ass off this year. I have worked for this podcast. I've worked for writing. I've pursued multiple creative endeavors. And you know what? I fucking finished them too. I released a fucking book right before this episode came out. I fucking did it, despite the fact that I'm working a full-time job, despite the fact that I've been working several full-time jobs that have been fucking shitty. And it feels like this album understands where I am in my life right now and all the difficulties that it entails, and it inspires me to push past all of it. If Punisher last year was an album that made dealing with the darkness okay, The World is a Beautiful Place's album this year makes me shine a light in that darkness and makes it disappear. I'm not weepy or emotional over my favorite album of the year this year. I mean, I can be, but if anything, it's just purely because it inspires me. So thank you to all involved who made this wonderful, wonderful record.
To our number 11 now, and an album that maybe not to that extent, but probably has me a similar level of emotional. So in our best songs of the year video, I talked about the song Triple Dog Dare and the beauty and intensity and detail and stunning rendering of human beings and stories and particular emotions associated with particular times of your life that Lucy's able to do in her songwriting. And I truly believe her to be probably the best singer-songwriter who is currently working in this current sort of era of music that we are experiencing right now. I don't think there's a single singer-songwriter who writes more acutely and meaningfully and with more talent and beauty than Lucy. And I didn't expect this necessarily to bowl me over the way that it did. I liked Lucy's first record, Historian. I think it has some great songs on it, but she was always kind of the black sheep of the Boy Genius clan in the sense that she was maybe the least sort of comfortable in the spotlight for a while and the least sort of like globbed onto by a lot of like publications and stuff. I think because her approach is a little bit more intellectual and kind of like literate than the more immediately emotional styles of Phoebe Bridgers and Julian Baker, where it's like easy to connect and create a narrative around the artist. Whereas Lucy's like more of the writer's artist, right? Like she's more of the person who's a bit more insular in their art. She's meant for that person more so than Phoebe and Julian. And so to see her kind of really come into her own and just write some of the best songs that she's ever written consistently without exception on this album, which immaculately renders the feeling of looking back in your life, of experiencing nostalgia, the metaphorical image of the home video, right? The idea of revisiting periods of your past, periods of growing up that are, permanently tinged by the glow of a particular era, or the glow of time having passed, and metaphorically representing that with like the grain of videotape is just gorgeous and very poetic. And something I've talked about at length on the podcast this year is how, for me this year, doing the podcast and talking about and reflecting on a lot of albums I love has been about reflecting on the past for me, on my experience of growing up and becoming a music fan, and revisiting and recontextualizing a lot of the music that meant the most to me as a teenager. And this is essentially an album about doing that for every part of your life when you were younger, being in your mid to late 20s, and actually thinking back on how certain experiences and certain things, whether it's been relationships that you've been in, whether it's been friendships that you've had, whether it's been like things that you've witnessed and maybe wished in retrospect that you had done something different or done something more, or experiences that you've taken away, learning curves that you've taken away from things that you don't necessarily look back on as fondly. Lucy captures the feeling of being at that particular stage of your life where you're able to look back and recognize those things more easily, able to separate them a bit better from the pain or from the emotion and immediacy of the time they're associated with. It's a really mature work from Lucy, and one of the most satisfying and most enjoyable albums to truly live with. And in a lot of senses, listening to it is very therapeutic for me, because it helps me to get a better and stronger grasp on how to reckon with my things that have happened to me in the past that I want to try and move on from, or get a more stable relationship with psychologically. And this album is full of stories that show Lucy doing just that, rendering immaculate details of things like Bible camp in VBS, or her concerns about her friend's husband in Christine, or her first sexual experiences and first time, or her trying to support her friend, but also trying to deal with her own emotions about her friend's traumatic situation and Thumbs, or about a relationship that was problematic that she didn't really learn to understand and deal with in a song like Partners in Crime, or reckoning with boys and the relationship between, boys and girls and gender as you kind of grow older, and the way that changes in a song like Brando, or how you deal with and internalize and process having a friend who's incredibly suicidal and who you're worried about, and how you find ways to support them, but also how you have to kind of deal with the impact of that on you in a song like Please Stay. Every single song on this album has a beautiful life lesson, a beautiful, masterful story to tell as well, and a takeaway that makes you feel, or makes me feel at least, like stronger as a person from what Lucy has, the wisdom that Lucy has imparted to me. And that's a really rare thing. And I'll celebrate home video forever. It has already become like one of the stable records of this particular stage of my life, in the short time that it's been out, and it's a masterpiece in my opinion. All right, we're here.
Good.
The fucking top 10 albums of 2020 as per Jams and Tea, the only list that matters. TM. Number 10 on our list is one of the newest records on this list, the heavily awaited and intense collaboration between Converge and Chelsea Wolfe.
For those who know who either of these artists are, the idea of putting them together is, to put it in the terms of like film, imagine if like Martin Scorsese directed a Michael Mann script. Like, you're just shitting your pants. You're just pooping and peeing everywhere.
Shitting and farting all over the place.
Yeah, it is, and like it's pretty much exactly as good as you would hope it would be. Like, there's no dilution of songwriting because nobody kept their ego in check. Like, it's just complete synergy almost automatically. And I only say almost just because I know this project can get better.
Fucking bring on Blood Moon 2, please. I am simply begging. There's so many. I mean, that's a lot of why I think the affection is rooted here. Is that I'm pretty sure you and I both think this album is basically as good as the start of this can be, but also it creates a world of possibilities for the world of heavy music. You've got Chelsea, who's done heavier stuff before, but never quite something like this. And then you've got Converge, who they've kind of stayed in their own lane since the start of their career. But, last decade, those last two albums they're a little weirder, maybe a little more post-hardcore-ish. And now that you've got just the full-on collab, which feels revelatory. There are artists who are small enough to, like you said, keep their egos in check and sort of dilute what makes them special, but also they're big enough to have a defined, refined sound. And also, I'm just glad more people are looking into Chelsea's work now that an act as popular as Converge is working with her. It's incredibly fucking exciting, and it's heavy in all the ways you want exactly like something like this to be.
Number 9 on our list is an album that has come to mean a great deal to both Morgan and myself, and also an album that is one of the biggest surprises of the year in many ways, one of the most divisive albums of the year for a lot of audiences. That is, of course, and look, a lot has been said about the stylistic shift that Deaf Heaven make here. And I had made the point when we reviewed it that I don't see it as the big shocking, like, oh my God, they've, sacrificed everything that made them unique, reaction that a lot of people seem to have had. In many ways, especially looking back on a record like Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, this kind of trajectory seemed sort of inevitable for Deaf Heaven. They've always kind of balanced the really heavy sort of black metal side of their sound with the post-rock shoegaze side of their sound. They've made a point of doing that on each record, but it's been clear with a record like that, and now here with a record like Infinite Granite, that as the band have sort of aged and developed their sound, and particularly as songwriter, singer George Clark has sort of developed from the angsty young man he was on a record like Sunbather to the more contented and almost like hippie-ish figure that he is now on a record like this, sort of enjoying the kind of halcyon days of his like young life in a contented relationship, but also like reckoning with some of the darker aspects of his family, of his upbringing, his relationship with father figures, and his relationship with the darker parts of himself as well. All of that's still present, but it is reflected and refracted through a kind of sun-blind lens that beautifully brings all of those sunbathing, kind of like stark, gorgeous, ringing, beautiful elements of Deaf Heaven's earlier music and puts them front and center, kind of toning down the sort of ugliness and rawness of the black metal sound, bringing it in occasionally in certain parts, like on the bombastic closer Mombasa, but for the most part, exploring how Deaf Heaven can negotiate this prettier, transcendent sort of shoegaze space while maintaining the impact and the pulse and the hard-hitting sort of like nature that their rhythm section and the unit of the band have, and Kerry McCoy, their incredibly talented guitarist, continuing to play with texture and create a massively immersive soundscapes. Morgan, I know this album's meant a great deal to you this year. Do you want to recap sort of a little bit about how this album's resonated with you and why it's one of the best albums of the year in your opinion?
From the sound of it alone, it was just it had this really amazing tranquil, calming effect on me, and I could just really lose myself in just how dense and busy pretty much everything here is. And it's also just like something that I didn't know I wanted from this band, but now that it's here, I can't imagine not having it in terms of my relationship to this group. And that's something that's really special. It's frankly kind of amazing that this isn't my favorite of theirs, especially since it's my number 3 of the year.
I think the
Good.
other aspect to mention on this as well is that this is the most like holistic and flowing a Deaf Heaven album has ever been from start to finish as well. Like they've worked on this over the years, but like I think here more than ever they have perfected the melding between different kind of aspects of their sound and not necessarily having like stilted interludes like they have in the past, which is not to diss those interludes. Like they've always really worked really well. But here it feels like they've really refined what it means to make a compositional singular work of an album. And it's impossible to, or not impossible, but it's very difficult for me to listen to any one song on this album and not want to just like let it play through and then just experience the holistic wholeness of it. Yeah, and I think that's a really satisfying thing for the band to have really honed and achieved here. Number 8, continuing our top 10 countdown, and we have some more Morgan core. The Morgan train is not stopping, baby. We go to Morgan's album of the year.
My experience with this album at first was, I mean, I think it was like 1 a.m, or may have been around midnight, and I just looked, and I said, Killer's surprise release new album, Pressure Machine, and I was just like, are you fucking serious? Really? Okay, I can't imagine how half baked this is gonna be. And then I threw it on, and then the first thing I hear is West Hills, and I have to fully take a beat. Thank you. So there's that. And like, it's not that this album is great for the Killers. It's that this album is just plainly great. You know, my favorite band is the Menzingers. So this is like catnip, this kind of shit. And this is like the Springsteen, Nebraska effect turned up to 100 minus the minimal instrumentation, except that is also here on a couple songs. And it all just works. It's this seamlessly joyous and deeply emotional love letter, yet simultaneous reckoning with the nature of Brandon Flowers' hometown and his experience, the nature of his experience growing up in it, and the people who still live in it.
And in a lot of ways, I see it as kind of like a complementary record this year to Home Video by Lucy Dacus, because they're both albums about like artists reckoning with growing up in some form. And with Lucy, it's about her relationship to the people around her and how like her experiences with the people around her growing up have shaped the person she's become. And with Pressure Machine, it's more about like on the macro scale, like the landscape and the people themselves, not so much Brandon Flowers' relationship with it, although that kind of subtextually you get hints about how he feels and you can infer about his sort of relationship and nostalgia and complicated feelings from the songs themselves. But the focus is on telling those stories, on allowing the landscape itself to be the character of the album, as opposed to on a record like Home Video where Lucy herself is always front and center. So that's, I think, a cool thing that makes this album particularly unique and special. And I think something that is a big part of why it resonates so much with you, Morgan, as well, and Jake as well, with holding the fucking vinyl, like the fanboy of it that he is. And yeah, it's
I wouldn't say I'm a Killers fanboy.
I mean a fanboy of the album. I mean, but yeah.
Oh yeah, but you pointed out that it's very similar to Home Video. Notably, also, if I may speak to an element of the record that hasn't fully been touched on yet, is the sound of it. Both albums notably produced by Sean Everett, and yeah, again, this album produced by Sean Everett. It sounds like a War on Drugs album, and it fuck, this album sounds in fucking incredible. West Hills is one of my favorite songs of the year for a reason, and half of it is because Flowers is an immaculate performer, and the other half is because this album knows when to swing for the fences, just approximately when to hit the mark. This is the best Springsteen album since Darkness on the Edge of Town, and I say that half because of the technical acumen on display here, the instrumentation on songs like In a Car Outside or Pressure Machine itself, combined with the fact that Flowers is at his best that he's ever been. I mean, sure, Hot Fuss Flowers is like peak pop indie rock kind of hook, commanding, like immediately grab your attention, but this is the performance of a weathered soul, the performance of somebody who feels like they're painting a picture from somewhere, and it feels authentic and it feels real, and it's kind of been a salve of sort for me. It's just I worked at a really shitty factory this year for a while, and I saw a lot of people who were kind of, they were born here, and like the people on the spoken word segments of this album that really do a great job of painting the picture of Utah. And seeing and talking to people like that is an unreal experience, where you're talking to people who are, some of them are 1 foot in the grave, or some of them are, in their 20s and they look as though they're twice that. It's an unreal experience, and it's one that's important now to like recognize and think about, just because it's something that's kind of underrepresented in the overall sphere of art. It's something that's this album also talks a lot about the opioid crisis too, so it's something that's it's relevant in a way you might not expect.
Moving on then to the number 7 on our countdown of the top 10, and lo and behold, Morgan putting in work, because we have another Morgan core record back to back with Pressure Machine, another one of Morgan's favorite albums of the year. I believe is number 4 actually.
As someone who has been like fully on board with what this band has been doing for the past handful of years, really the past decade, I think Colors 2 is the most invigorated and excited and outright fascinating that Between the Buried and Me have sounded since The Great Misdirect. And I think Colors 2 is pretty much just as good as that album and its predecessor, the original Colors. Every time you listen to it is like trying to solve a puzzle box, and the puzzle box is the sickest shit you've ever heard in your life. I can't even complete that metaphor. Like just in like the 85 or so minutes that this album takes to go through every song, I like, at least the first time, at the very least, probably a bajillion times after that, I said to myself, what the fuck? Like, at least every 3 minutes there is like more music per capita on this album, more ideas than there is on like this entire list combined.
It's the best piece of zany, goofy, and at the same time brutal and devastating music we've seen all year. And that's what I find endearing about it, that it captures this spirit of fun and silliness whilst also being so out there and crushingly heavy.
Yeah, and I mean, it has stiff competition for that title with the very next album on our list. Number 6. I mean, talk about a artist coming through for us with albums that are uncompromising visions of just pure creative id, fucking transfused through some of the most exciting and breathtaking progressive music that the year has produced. I mean, both of these records are absolute testaments to that. But of course, the Tyler Core one is Black Midi through and fucking through. This album is a total fucking opus. Like, I didn't even know Black Midi were going to make an album like this quickly in their career. As I said in our best songs video when I talked about John 50 and my relationship with Black Midi being like, Schlagenheim was a cool warm-up, but I was hoping they would really realize what they were doing sonically, and I didn't frankly expect them to do it as quickly as they have here. But it's become apparent to me quite quickly this year that Cavalcade is, in my view, a prog rock masterpiece of our times, for the simple reason that in an age where progressive music is still kind of booming and doing its own thing, kind of somewhat in the underground, this is a band who have generated enough buzz to kind of transcend the out of fashion nature that prog has kind of developed in mainstream music and make connections with a new wave of a new generation of kids, a new audience, and still be some of the most unique, exciting progressive music, even if you are a person who's really seasoned in prog and knows like a lot about progressive music and how it's developed over the years. It still sounds exciting. It's not just, hey, these kids have discovered my first prog band and they're fine, but they've discovered my first prog band and they are genuinely one of the most exciting bands working today. And Cavalcade is an utter carnival, fucking wild funhouse of musical exploration and insanity. The ways in which Black Midi are able to incorporate brass and their really unique and strange guitar tones and weird ways of playing guitar, their unique performance style, the absolutely insatiable drumming of Morgan Simpson, and the general rhythm section competency of the band overall. And of course, let us not forget the utterly uncompromising personality of frontman, who I'm not entirely convinced is a human being, Geordie Greep.
John 50 comes to town.
Certainly not a human name.
Well, he's able, like, I can't believe this kid is like, you know, younger than me. He has like a monster within him, or multitudes within him, that he's able to channel when he portrays characters on this record, when he truly lets loose, when he shows off the various vocal ranges that he has. And the band absolutely just launch into some of the most arcane and bizarro, you know, compositions they've ever constructed, in the form of songs like Slow and Ascending Forth and Dethroned and Hogwash and Balderdash. It's an album that breaks your door down from front to back. It has one slower track in the form of Diamond Stuff, but the rest of it is just blistering through and through, and it never loses sense of that just energizing pace that it has constantly. And I can't get enough of it. It's just one of the most exciting and original albums of 2021. And if you haven't checked it out yet, you're missing out. It is, it won't be for everyone. It may just be something that just is too much to consume for you. But if you're able to get on the wavelength of this band, then they will get you in their vice grip and they will not let you go. And it's easy to see why a feverish cult have developed around them, because which is funny because they kind of talk about and reference sort of cults topics on this album, and topics of kind of leadership and the kind of carnivalesque nature of modern politics, subtextually, but also like in their own unique, goofy, silly way.
You know, they've got a, like I said in our songs video, their sound is very much a synthesis of their influences to, I think, an obvious degree. But as I said again, and I'll repeat it in this video, what makes them entertaining is having those influences in present year, and the way they are able to take those sounds and make something that still feels fresh, relevant, punchy, and fun. And yeah, it's an enjoyable listen. I mean, for me, it even has its ups and downs, but that is so much the part of it, just them throwing all they can at the wall, and you as a listener parsing through that and saying, I don't even know if all this works for me, but the end result is impressive and interesting enough as it is.
Okay, well, that brings us to the top 5 albums of the year for the Jams and Tea podcast. We're finally here. And with number 5,
Before I talked about my favorite song on here, which is my favorite song of the year in the form of Until We Meet Again, I kind of let it off with the fact that I was, I put forth a reasonable stance as to why the bias didn't cloud me. And if I'm going to be reasonable there, I'll be unreasonable here and say, if you don't think what I have to say is genuine, go fuck yourself, because this is one of the best albums to come out this year. It's one of the best ambient albums I've ever listened to. And that means something, because August's and Mason's initiative with their project and their love of ambient music has pushed me to explore this entire world of music that I just really hadn't looked into before. And I've listened to so much more ambient music, which is maybe the album's best accomplishment, is that it made me want to see what inspired it. It made me want to understand what led to the endpoint creation of it, which has been one of the most satisfying journeys I've taken all year. And I mean, we did an exceptional job of breaking this down track by track, but really the special thing about Glacier Flower is the thing I alluded to in the songs video, which is that it just takes you to another world, but you still feel like all of it's relatable. Emotionally speaking, it all comes from a very recognizable, identifiable place. That first track does such a great job of putting you in the perfect headspace to experience the rest of it. And I don't have an issue with this album. Everything about it works. It's all a uniform journey. It's all a unified sound. It's all perfect at being this expression and this distillation of everything August and Mason have felt up until this point. And their absolute creative synergy on here is just, I mean, they are properly in sync with one another. And it makes me so excited to continue to see where the narrative of Glacier Flower goes, just because, they're an independent music act. They haven't taken off or anything, but this is the kind of thing that I'm just like, if the world could hear this, they would be awestruck by it. Like, this is the kind of thing that, like, I want to push forward for people to listen to, not just because my friend made it, but because, like, if this was an album that all of Rate Your Music could listen to, I genuinely feel like this would make like the top 50 of the year or something, just because it's the perfect kind of album to be latched onto and like consumed by people right now. It's so of the moment and vital, but it has a precedent in things that people in this avenue of music truly love. It's evocative, it's emotional. It's one I've listened to this album so many times this year. Just I can't, like, it's been my default album. Like, when I've just been like walking around or doing something and I needed something to listen to, this was always what I defaulted to. And I never regretted that decision, just because it's always so atmospheric, it's so enrapturing, and I can't wait to listen to this forever. Like, this is one of my favorite records ever at this point. It's one of my favorite ambient albums, and I'm gonna be spinning it forever. I want people to listen to this purely because, like, for every reason I said, but also because I want it to be successful enough so that I can own it on vinyl one day.
Yeah, I think the big thing about this that makes it really special beyond just how gorgeous it sounds is something that's not surprising when you know August and what he values in album construction, which is that for an ambient record, it has a remarkable emotional arc to it. Like, it has a remarkable sense of self-justification in terms of the way that it's structured and the way that it emotionally develops, from that somber opening to the utter, transcendent emotional bliss of Until We Meet Again, and then the creepy epilogues that follow it. It's a real record of craft. And I think people who appreciate craft and structure and being taken on an emotional journey through pure waves of sound will really respond to this album. So it can't really get a higher endorsement than that, I don't think. All right, continuing the countdown now, moving on to our fourth favorite album of the year, and we have one of the first albums of the year that it felt like we were all kind of really just like, fuck, this is special. And it's a lovely moment when that happens on the podcast. Not that it's terribly surprising with an artist as esteemed as Nick Cave, but Morgan, why don't you talk for a little bit about what impression this record gave you when you heard it, and why you think it's a great album for Nick, above and beyond just Nick Cave made it. What do you think is special about this album? Why it's one of the best albums of the year?
Well, let's start by saying that this is the only good quarantine album, and like I don't mean that in the sense that it is the only good album made during quarantine. That would be stupid. But I am saying it is the only album that is about quarantine that is good, not even like in spite of that fact, but because it is about quarantine in the last 2 years, or the last year really, in terms of when it was written. Like, it sounds unbelievable, but I mean, that's not surprising considering the pedigree involved. Yeah, this is an album that reckons with the last couple of years now, and with such clarity and stunning beauty in ways that pretty much no other album has. Like, the fact that I didn't want to kill myself listening to this goes a long way to discussing its quality, because it is heavy and prescient, which is two things that we are all sick of with art. And, just leave it to Nick Cave and Warren Ellis to do that correctly.
The thing about Carnage and the work of Nick Cave in this decade is that I feel as though it's sort of the logical endpoint to this sort of like phase almost, and the point where it might not even be an endpoint, but the beginning of a new phase almost, just because this feels like the logical progression of starting with Push the Sky Away. I feel like, he's been playing with this more moody electronic stuff, and I feel like Ghosteen showed a push towards this particular sound and utilized the sound of it in a very creative way, whereas this album sort of takes that and kind of perfects it. It doesn't matter in like the way that it's using it, but just the raw sound of it feels like Warren Ellis's contribution to Nick's oeuvre has reached its apex. So this could either be like a moment for the band where they like get to a point as an artist to be like a standout thing, or it could be the beginning of like the true series of swan song records that Nick makes in his twilight years. So I mean, goddamn.
Moving swiftly along, then we have our top fucking 3 albums of the year, and
I am covered.
I don't know why I'm kind of surprised this next album made it so high on our final list. I shouldn't be, because we all really, really liked it, and I think 2 of us at least gave it perfect scores. But we really dug into the weeds with this record, and it feels like, truly, if we could describe any of the albums that have come out this year as a kind of rich intellectual text, let's trust it to be that the latest opus from one Kristen Hayter, aka Lingua Ignota, who has
you better get ready.
Who has gifted us with an album that almost feels like a fucking challenge to even like begin to piece apart or interpret. I mean, when I think back on the segment that we spent sort of talking about that album, we talked about it for over an hour, just trying to like articulate the theories that we had about what Kristen was trying to say about religion and interpersonal relationships and her own kind of psychological well-being and state of mind. And obviously that information is contextualized and fed by the various things that we know about Kristen's personal life and the previous music that she's made as well. But Sinner Get Ready itself truly feels like its own cohesive statement in a way where Caligula, her previous record, as great as that was, did definitely feel like it was building on or expanding the world of All Bitches Die, her debut record. This is truly a holistic, singular statement in and of itself. And to try and summarize or articulate the dense tapestry or points that Kristen tries to make with the various songs on this record is not possible to do, I think, concisely, except to say that it has a broad and vast and troublesome and dense and thorough and emotional journey through worship, journey through relationships, journey through the dynamic of power between one person and another in any kind of relationship, the ways in which that can approximate worship, the ways in which religion itself can serve as a tool for both subjugation and for salvation, the ways in which historical manifestations of religion within a landscape that Christian is surrounded in can function as like past demons kind of impinging upon her as she deals with her own current trauma. There's so much to try and even comprehend and conceive within this album that I can't blame you if you simply want to sit in awe of just the musicality of it, the sheer ambition and dynamics of the way in which she's able to wring power out of the subtle, out of the quiet, and also, you know, on songs like Pennsylvania Furnace, which we talked about in our Best Songs video, but also to just make the most cacophonous, raw, brutal sounds on songs like Many Hands as well. The ways in which she's able to navigate the different forms of, you know, religious music and various sort of hymnals and things that influence her as a musical artist, but transfigurate them into the place that she is now. It's truly a behemoth of a work. Like it's in many ways, you know, it's not done justice to compare to the other records on this list because it's so much more than just a set of songs. It feels like a whole sort of thesis, not to get too pretentious about it, but that's really just how it feels when you listen to it. Yeah, I mean, Jake, it's a big favorite of yours as well. Do you want to add some fuel to the fire here?
Caligula was a really important album for me, and honestly, I just sort of figured that would be the apex of what she would do or what she could do. And then Sinner Get Ready comes in like a fucking just absolutely whoops your ass, and you're just like, you know, even if you might prefer Caligula for one reason or another, I feel like it's just undeniable the raw ambition of what's going on here. And Kristen's singularity as an artist of just incorporating so many different kinds of sounds and genres and not really belonging to any of them. She's such a perfect emblem of what artists can do now, because like there's no like era in which this kind of music you could put it down specifically to be like, oh, this would be successful here or there, but it's just like I feel like she's the logical endpoint of a culture that promotes artists who don't sound like anything else and allows them to kind of flourish and find their audience because of the ubiquitousness of things like the internet. And it's such a standout piece. I mean, it's just so, it's emotional, it's dense, it's exciting. You can pour through it like a novel, and getting to that final track, you really do feel, I mean, you feel like you're at the fucking end of Return of the King. You just sort of look back and you're like, God, we've really been some places, Kristen. I fucking, you know, more power to her. I'm really glad this album was the runaway success that it was, because she has earned every single second of it. Just not even as something that was like, this was born from a really traumatic thing of her, but just as an artist in and of it herself, divorced from that. She is a genius, and she deserves to be applauded because of that genius and that genius alone.
Well, here we are, the number 2 album of the year. And I mean, how the fuck this isn't the album of the year? And yet the album of the year thoroughly deserves its place. I will not know. But we have, of course, the masterpiece, the album that has topped 2 of our individual year-end lists.
Simply put, the reason this was so profoundly exciting to me was I just had no way of expecting it. There was no precedent by which I had in my musical knowledge to expect, listen to, and consume something like this. And when this came out in March, and I first heard it, I knew I had heard the best album I would hear all year right then and there, because it is so this perfect balance of emotional evocation and instrumental proficiency. It is, and all being in a language I do not speak. This album is so understanding of the emotions it wants to convey. It is an album you feel more than an album you listen to. You can understand it even without speaking Korean, because the emotions packed into this come from Parannoul as a singer, as an instrumentalist. They come from this combination of everything he's doing, and it is a gut punch and a warm hug of an album, both simultaneously. The piercing electronics are addicting to listen to. The sweet, tender vocal performances are so mesmerizing. Most every element about this works for me. And I think, as with my previous album of the year, Microphones in 2020, the reason it clicks for me is because it's not a genre I would typically expect to enjoy. It does not slot neatly into my pre-established taste in music. And that's what's so exciting about it, that it feels new, it feels fresh, and it also feels, as with the Injury Reserve album, like something that had to have been made within the past 5 or so years, because of how distinctly on the line this album is, how modern the production is, how forward thinking it is. It is something that could not exist prior to this. And that's really what I've looked for in albums this year. Something I can't go back to 2010 and find an equivalent to. This is fresh, this is new, this is exciting, and damn it, it makes me weep like a baby from time to time.
Yeah, I share the sentiment that you expressed of, after having this record in your life for a certain amount of time in March 2021, I also felt like this is my album of the year, and I just can't see anything topping it. It's not a matter of like it's so great, nothing can top it, but it's just like it immediately made sense and fit into this kind of personal little space I didn't know that I needed filled. I've waxed lyrical this year about how exciting I find this new particular wave of shoegaze influenced emo that also like is heavily digitized. Like, one thing that's worth noting about this record is there's no actual organic guitar on it. It's all electronic, it's all synthesized, it's all done on laptops. And so like it is in many ways kind of like the apotheosis of this development of digitized, noise-driven like music made by young people who are often very sad, who are sometimes queer as well, who often have a lot to sort of unpack through this music, and who are channeling into a lineage of emo and of emotional indie rock that has remained steadfast since the 90s and has developed and evolved as youth culture has evolved from Gen X to Gen Y to Gen Z, right? Like it's totally completely representative of and emblematic of the way that music has shifted, and the place right now that this particular brand of like hard on sleeve bedroom indie rock emo is at, and it does executes that vision through just immaculate songwriting, pure just howls of sheer emotion, absolutely classic sounding melodies instantaneously, drawing together influences as far and wide as Deaf Heaven and Smashing Pumpkins and everything in between, and truly just amalgamating itself into this colossal sort of monolith of sheer distorted, abrasive noise bliss. And more than any other record this year, more than any other record in several years, it feels like a true kind of emotional landmark for art for me. And I can't fathom a record coming along that could be its equal for me in that respect. Like, all I have to do is put on a song like White Ceiling, or put on a song like Beautiful World, or put on a song like I Can Feel My Heart Touching You, and listen to the way that the music swells, the ways in which the melodies kind of yearn and just bleed through the haze and the noise and the distortion and the clipping, and just feel my entire insides melt and become some fucking cosmic soup in one with the music, and then feel my entire soul immolate and then be reborn from the ashes by the time the album finishes. It is truly an album for our times. It is the best emo record since Jimmy Eat World's Clarity, and it is the best shoegaze record since My Bloody Valentine's Love List, and it is my album of 2021. But the album of 2021 had to be an album that we all agreed on. I believe it is the only album that made all 4 of our top 20 lists. And so as such, it beautifully and unquestionably takes its place as the #1 album of 2021 for this, the first full year of Jams and Tea. And what else could it be?
Panopticon is an act that I and Morgan have been following for a good while, back in our days on Sputnik Music. They, Austin, particular front man of the band, he has other collaborators, notably Eric Mogridge on this album, but his projects tend to get a lot of buzz on a website like that, and after finding out they were from Kentucky, it's just kind of like, naturally, gotta look into this. And his entire career is nothing but home runs, if you ask me. Dude hasn't made an album that is anything short of fucking excellent. And now he has come out guns blazing and made his best project. And there's a couple reasons as to why I think this is so special and why I think it resonated with the 4 of us like it did. Firstly, I mean, there is no getting around the fact that there's a unique blend here that even in the venue of atmospheric black metal isn't often seen. There is a blend of folk and of bluegrass music that on their own, not a particularly common subgenre of music. But the blend here is not only the most obvious that it's ever been, but I think it's also at its most successful. The sound of it does sort of have a nostalgic evocation on the album's lighter, more plaintive moments. It really does kind of make me remember parts of my childhood and places where I grew up. And that's really cool to feel from a project like this. But one thing about it that's notable that we really heavily emphasized when it came out was the production. And the production on this album is oppressive. This is an album that is mired in, it's like the Bandcamp page, as Tyler pointed out, said it was excruciatingly mixed. And that is 100% true. If you can, you need to listen to this album in the highest quality you can listen to. But over the course of the year, I haven't been able to always listen to the FLAC files of this. And even in its less clear form, there's definitely like I've grown to sort of appreciate the claustrophobia, because as the title of the record implies, and again into the light, it submerges you in darkness purely to drag you out of it. And it does so effectively. One notable thing about Panopticon is that he never releases lyrics that accompany his albums. And I know that that can be a stumbling block for some people. I know August actually voiced that as a criticism of the album when we first reviewed it. And I definitely understand that. But to me, that's been an aspect of the record that feels almost essential to my enjoyment at this point. The fact that I can only make out some words sometimes or can't understand them, it feels like it's the music is trying to fill in the gaps for what words can't say. It's something that allows you to sort of imprint your own meaning onto it. And I don't say that like it's like a lazy way or it's a shortcoming of the record. It's not. It's a feature. And this album so excellently composes each one of its songs. Like Dead Loons, I already talked about on our songs list, is that it's a song that purposefully sort of starts in a more minimal way just to drag you through the fucking mud through the rest of it. And it's so good at those instrumental apexes that it rises to. The incorporation of strings onto this album is a masterstroke. Every single time it's implemented, it's dynamic. It builds upon what came before it. The compositions are just so universally impressive and how they're built off of each other, and they have a synergy to them that makes them feel both of at peace with one another, but also very distinct. Is that there's no point on this album where one song sounds different or sounds too similar to the other, but never different enough to feel disparate. All of it feels like it's of the same journey. And it does give you those moments to breathe. It does give you moments in certain songs to just sort of pull back. But overall, on the sort of like, if you take away from the fact that when this album gets heavy and those like I think one of the most memorable moments in all of music, this album has plenty of them, in music for this year, is the something like the riff on Rope Burn Exit is fuck, it's so fucking hard. You're just like bum 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 burn out. And every song is like that. Songs like Snowless Winter just absolutely mire you. And it actually, like, Snowless Winter just sort of evokes the imagery that this album does. But I mean, stuff like Agalok is invoked in a lot of this album. The oppressiveness is something that you do have to get past, but it's something that I wholeheartedly believe makes the album better. It makes the brighter moments shine all the more. And I can't think of an album that I've needed more than one that recognizes and acknowledges darkness and understands that darkness, but also understands how much more effective light can be when set up with contrast. It's an album that embodies the entirety of 2020 and 2021 for me, the experience of your lowest and your highest. And this album instrumentally is able to say so much more than any lyric possibly could. It's just like the Parannoul album in that regard, and that you can look up the lyrics and that might be able to enhance your experience a little bit, but it speaks volumes with the music itself. It has no language barrier. There's nothing here that you could do to enhance it, in my opinion. The something like the final track, No Hope, that title tells you everything you need to know. This is an album that understands what it's like to be at your lowest, but it also understands how triumphant it feels to claw past that. This is an album where you feel like you are literally crawling through the mud and dirt and shit just to get that glimpse of a sunrise. And when you get there, it is the most beautiful thing on planet Earth. This is somehow my favorite metal album I've ever heard, purely because of that. It never gets old. Every decision is in service to something that speaks to me on a different level. It's a sound that makes me feel nostalgic for my childhood, but also makes me feel as though it's progressing beyond what I ever could have thought possible for music. It is a stunning achievement, and I'm so glad that it's our number one this year, because it's so specifically us. I couldn't imagine anything else being here.
Once again, Jake, you need to stop being so good at your job, because
I didn't prepare shit for this, man. I thought I was gonna fumble the bag. So
exactly, you didn't prepare and you just dropped that. Fuck. Yeah, it's a
drop that fuck.
I mean, I did not prepare last year and dropped an all-timer. Now it was Jake's turn. So next year, it's yours.
One thing I want to acknowledge, I think Jake, you've already mentioned it anyway, but our top 2 albums of the year are both records where the sound and the mixing and the just general production style could be a huge barrier for a lot of people. I mean, when I heard both of these records for the first time, I was expecting there to be more contention about that among us, and there ended up being none, which is hilarious. But it might be something that holds you back, and I think maybe it's maybe slightly more difficult to overcome. It could be slightly more difficult to overcome with the Panopticon record in particular, because you're hearing sort of black metal in a way that's produced, and I love your description of it being like mired in the darkness and the dirt and clawing your way up to the light, because that is exactly how it feels. You need to hear it on really good headphones, and you need to hear it really loud. And I don't want to hear anyone going, well, if you need to hear it on really good headphones, really loud for it to be good, then maybe it's not good. Fuck you. Jake just said it still sounded good even when it wasn't in FLAC. But the point is, you need to allow yourself the full experience that a record like this demands in order to just bask in the majesty of it. And it might not be for you. It might still not be for you. I think, if anything, this podcast has demonstrated that we maybe have more of a proclivity towards metal and maybe more underground or unusual forms of metal than, most sort of conventional music commentary channels on YouTube. But if you're able to dig into this, and if you're able to immerse yourself in this world, I think there's a genuine possibility that everyone out there will find something rewarding to uncover within the world of this amazing album. August, is there anything that you want to add on Panopticon's And Again Into the Light?
Beautiful, beautiful record. Beautiful in a very unconventional, non-traditional sense. It's a beauty you have to have the right ears for, but if you do, it's very easy to see.
I love that these ended up being our 2 favorite albums of the year because, well, I mean, for one thing, thankfully, they both seem to be sort of, more underground and online circles, of course, but like they are 2 albums that got really great reception and by all accounts, most people liked and latched onto, and that's fucking great. But they also represent a moment in time for like, it feels like Panopticon couldn't really be an act that's successful at any point in time other than the 2010s. And Parannoul is something that speaks so vitally to the moment right now and to many people, is that they are quintessentially modern albums that do not date themselves. This is going to be just as effective in 10 years as it is right now. It's not something that's so idiosyncratic that it limits itself. But what's wonderful about it is that these are so specific projects. There's like Punisher and Ohms and stuff, those are albums with very wide appeal. Like those are albums that a lot of people really, really loved. And these are too, but to a greater extent of like, this just makes me so happy that music like this is even allowed to exist in the first place. Like the fact that this atmospheric black metal album that like most people could look at and just be like, oh, well, the guitar doesn't sound as clean or as good as it could. And it's just like, it's not about that. It's about engaging with music on a level where the guitar sound isn't a guitar sound. It's just a part of the song. You hear the music for what it is, not the isolated elements that make up what it is. And that's the power of music.
Well, I mean, is there any better way to end like a video like this than that's the power of music? Like, I mean, Jesus.
Fuck no, there ain't.
We've broken music down to its bare essentials.
Austin 1, you've done it.
But yeah, I mean, shit.
Woo! Pissed. Fuck.
I like that, like you say, these are 2 records that have been really widely well received, but they're also not, I'm not seeing them, topping or even placing highly on a lot of like publications and outlets year-end lists so far.
The mainstream media.
So we're really like, I think it's nice and satisfying that our sort of top of the year has its own kind of like identity and like isn't just kind of like necessarily the same thing everyone else is picking. But also like not for the sake of being different. It just happened to be that this was the way it was. But yeah,
No, that's the Jams and Tea podcast, fucking priority is that we can we're gaining a following, and now we can share our love for things that deserve more attention. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yep. And that's basically all there is to it. Let us know in the comments below what you think of this list. Please give us your favorite albums of the year lists in the comments below. We want to see lists popping up in the comments below. We want to hear your feedback on the albums we've discussed, albums we haven't discussed as well. What do you think were the snubs? What do you think should have been shouted out? What are your thoughts in general on the best albums and music of 2021? We want to hear from you in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure you give it a like. It really helps us, every single person who does that. If you're already subscribed to the channel, thank you. If you're not already subscribed to the channel and you've enjoyed this video or you enjoy anything that we do, please consider subscribing. And if you want to go the extra mile and support us, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can give us a little bit of extra support. And as a result of that, we will feature your name in every video that we do. We will give you priority response and comments if you want to ask questions or give recommendations. We have a series of emojis that we're going to be rolling out for you to use in comments as well, and more perks that we'll be adding in the new year. 2022 is about to be a big year for Jams and Tea, and we are really, really excited to show to you and reveal to you all of the things that we have planned and the expansions for the Jams and Tea family and the Jams and Tea kind of like content initiatives that we have kind of started and built on this year now that we have 1,000 subscribers. So yeah, thank you to all of you, every single one of you who's watched one of our videos this year, last year, anytime. Thank you for sticking around to this point.
Wonderful year.
And we're really grateful for every single one of you. And even the people who have left shitty hater comments were valuable for the metrics you've added to our to what
Thank
we've done.
for feeding the algorithm, fuckface.
Yeah, so thank you for feeding the algorithm. We have love in our hearts for all of you, especially if you're as gay as we are. And we'll be back again very soon. We're not even done with fresh content for the year, to be honest. Keep an eye on our Twitter feed for announcements of upcoming videos. We have some hot shit coming your way. We will be back, I think, the first Sunday of the new year. We'll be back with more new release reviews for albums that we missed in December, and more record clubs, and a new retrospective on the Dillinger Escape Plan as well, which we're looking to kick off too. So plenty to be excited about. So make sure that you stick around for all of that. Check out our other list videos if you haven't already. They'll be linked in the description. And yeah, August, it's up to you to lead us home.
All right,
for the last time
bitches. Rock over London, rock on Chicago, Ron Seal. It does exactly what it says on the tin.